A sealed letter slipped from a trembling hand just as the young gentleman drew his final breath, and before anyone in the chamber could reach it, Duke Theodore Marsden caught the wax seal bearing his closest friend's crest. Every eye followed him as he broke it open, only to find one impossible request. His dying friend begged him to marry the woman waiting faithfully for him in a quiet village near Brampton Hollow, not for wealth, not for duty, but because she would be left with nothing except a promise no one else knew existed. Before the mourners had even left Marsden Court, the Duke rode through the night to find the forgotten fiancée, only to discover that another powerful household had already arrived at her humble home with plans of their own. Tell me honestly, if your dearest friend placed such a promise in your hands with his final breath, would you keep it no matter the cost, or would you refuse and let fate choose for itself? Hold on to your answer, because before this story ends, you may find yourself changing it more than once. I will be looking through your comments to see whether your first answer still feels right. While you're here, let us know which beautiful part of the world you're watching from, and if you enjoy timeless tales of dukes, impossible promises, and love born where no one expected it, remember to subscribe so you won't miss the next story. Now, the Duke tightened his grip on the letter, turned his horse toward the waiting village, and unknowingly rode straight into the greatest battle his heart would ever face. The candle beside the bed had burned down to a stub, but no one in the room dared to replace it. Duke Theodore Marsden knelt at his friend's side, gripping a hand that had already gone cold at the fingertips. Gerald Ashcombe had been strong once, the kind of man who laughed loudest at supper and rode fastest across the fields of Brampton Hollow. Now his chest rose in short, broken pulls, and the physician standing near the door had already given up pretending otherwise. "Theodore," Gerald whispered, and the Duke leaned closer so he would not have to ask twice. "I am here. I have not left your side since Tuesday, and I will not leave it now." Gerald's fingers twitched against the blanket. He reached toward the small table beside him, where a folded letter sat sealed with red wax, pressed by his own signet ring. His hand shook too badly to lift it, so Theodore took it for him, holding it up so his friend could see it had not been lost. "Swear to me," Gerald said. "Swear you will read it only after I am gone, and swear you will do exactly what it asks. You ask me to swear blindly. I ask you because I trust no one else with it." Gerald's eyes, though dimmed with fever, held steady on his friend's face. "You are the only man alive who keeps his word, even when it costs him everything." Theodore did not answer right away. Around them, the room had gone silent, except for the ticking clock on the mantel and the soft weeping of Gerald's aunt near the window. He looked at the letter, then at his friend's face, pale as the linen beneath him. "I swear it," Theodore said finally. "On my father's grave, I swear it." Gerald's shoulders relaxed as though a great weight had lifted from them. He smiled faintly, the first real smile Theodore had seen from him in weeks. "Then I can rest," he murmured. Tell her I tried to come back for her. Tell her I never stopped trying." Tell who? But Gerald's eyes had already closed, and his breathing slowed until it stopped altogether. The physician stepped forward and pressed 2 fingers to his neck, then shook his head once. The aunt let out a cry and pressed her face into her handkerchief. Theodore remained kneeling, the letter still clutched in his hand, staring at his friend's still face, as though waiting for him to breathe again. He did not move for a long while. The servants came and went, lighting fresh candles, calling for the undertaker, sending word to the family solicitor. Theodore heard none of it clearly. His mind stayed fixed on the weight of the letter in his palm, and the promise he had made without knowing its price. When the room finally emptied enough for privacy, he broke the seal. The handwriting inside was shaky, clearly written in Gerald's final days when his strength had already begun to fail. Theodore read it once quickly, then again slowly, his brow drawing tighter with each line. Gerald had been engaged, secretly, to a woman named Margaret Colworth, a vicar's daughter, living in a modest cottage near the edge of Brampton Hollow. Their engagement had been kept hidden because Gerald's family disapproved of her low standing, and because Gerald had hoped to build enough fortune through his trading ventures to present her properly once he returned from his travels. But illness had struck him on his journey home, and he had spent his final weeks confined to his bed, unable to send word to her directly, without alerting his family to a connection they would try to end. The letter begged Theodore to find her, to tell her the truth of what had happened, and more than that, to marry her himself, so she would never be left destitute or shamed by a broken engagement no one could prove had ever existed. Theodore lowered the letter slowly. He thought of every promise he had ever made in his life. Promises about land, about inheritance, about duty to his title. None of them had asked what this one asked. Marriage was not a favor one did for a dying friend. It was a bond meant to last a lifetime, built on choice, not obligation. And yet Gerald's face, pale and pleading in his final hour, would not leave his mind. By morning, Theodore had made his decision. He would ride to Brampton Hollow himself, not to promise marriage outright, but to see this woman, to understand the truth Gerald had left him, and to decide from there what a man of honor was meant to do. He called for his horse before the sun had fully risen. His valet protested that mourning required at least a few days of stillness, that society would expect him to grieve properly before taking any journey. Theodore ignored every word of it. He tucked the letter into his coat, mounted his horse, and rode out through the gates of Marsden Court, as the morning mist still clung low to the fields. The journey took most of the day. Brampton Hollow sat far from the main roads, a small village surrounded by hills and old stone fences, the kind of place society rarely noticed and never visited. When Theodore finally arrived, the sun had begun sinking behind the hills, casting long shadows across the narrow lanes. He asked a shopkeeper for directions to the vicar's cottage, and the man pointed him down a lane, lined with low hedges. As Theodore approached, he saw another carriage, already stopped outside the small house, an elegant one, far too grand for the modest street it occupied. Two men stood near the door, dressed in fine coats that marked them as gentry, speaking with an older woman who wrung her hands nervously at the threshold. Theodore dismounted quickly and walked toward them, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. "Forgive my intrusion," he said, drawing the attention of both men. "I am looking for Miss Margaret Colworth." The taller of the two men turned to face him with a look of open suspicion. "And who might you be, arriving unannounced at this hour?" "Duke Theodore Marsden," he answered simply, and watched both men stiffen at the title. The older woman at the door, clearly the housekeeper, dropped into a hurried curtsy. "Your Grace, forgive me. I did not know you were expected." "I was not expected. I have come on a matter of great importance concerning Miss Colworth." The taller gentleman recovered his composure quickly, though his eyes narrowed with something close to distrust. "Then you have arrived at an inconvenient time, Your Grace. I am Mr. Nathaniel Price, and this is my brother. We have come with an offer for Miss Colworth's hand, on behalf of our family's estate." Theodore felt something tighten in his chest, though he kept his expression even. An offer of marriage? Indeed. Her father's passing left her with little support, and my family has long admired her character. We came the moment we heard of her circumstances. Her father has passed as well. The housekeeper nodded sadly. 3 months now, Your Grace. The poor girl has been managing alone since, taking in mending work to keep the cottage running. Theodore absorbed this quietly. Gerald's letter had said nothing of the vicar's death, only that Margaret waited faithfully in the village. It seemed fate had already begun rewriting the story before he arrived to claim any part in it. "I would like to speak with her myself," Theodore said. "Alone, if it is permitted." Mr. Price's jaw tightened. "I hardly see what business a duke has with a vicar's daughter, unless your intentions mirror our own." "My intentions are my own, to explain, and hers to hear first." Theodore's voice carried the quiet authority of a man used to being obeyed without argument. "I will not keep her long." The housekeeper led Theodore through a narrow hallway toward the back of the cottage, where a small garden sat wrapped in the last light of evening. Margaret Colworth knelt beside a row of herbs, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hands stained with soil. She looked up as his shadow fell across the path, and for a moment neither of them spoke. She was younger than he expected, though the weariness in her eyes made her seem older than her years. Her face held none of the polished society women wore, yet there was a quiet strength in the way she rose to her feet, wiping her hands on her apron before offering a small curtsy. "Forgive me, sir. I was not told we had a visitor." "I am Duke Theodore Marsden," he said, watching her expression shift from confusion to something closer to alarm. "I have come on behalf of Gerald Ashcombe." Her hands stilled completely. "Gerald," she whispered, as though testing whether the name still belonged to the living. "You know Gerald. He was my closest friend." Theodore hesitated, searching for gentler words, though none came easily. "I am sorry to tell you he passed 2 nights ago." Margaret's face was drained of color. She reached for the low garden wall to steady herself, and Theodore stepped forward instinctively, though he stopped short of touching her. "That cannot be true," she said, though her voice already trembled with belief. "He wrote to me only last month. He said he was recovering, that he would return before the harvest. He fell ill again on his journey home. He never reached you." Theodore reached into his coat and produced the letter, holding it out to her. "He left this for me, with instructions I intend to honor." She took the letter with shaking hands, unfolding it slowly. Theodore watched her eyes move across the lines, watched the moment her breath caught somewhere in her throat, as she read her own name written in Gerald's fading hand. When she finished, she pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes, tears slipping silently down her face. "He remembered me," she whispered. "Even at the end, he remembered me. He asked something of me that I am still deciding how to honor," Theodore said carefully. "He asked that I marry you myself, so you would not be left without protection." Margaret's eyes snapped open, startled. "Marry me? Your Grace, I am no one. I have no fortune, no family name worth mentioning. Surely he did not mean for you to bind yourself to such a burden. He did not see you as a burden. Neither, I think, should I. You do not know me at all." "No," Theodore admitted. "But I knew him, and he trusted you enough to risk everything for a future with you. That tells me something worth trusting as well." Margaret looked away, toward the darkening hills beyond the garden wall. "There are men inside your own party who came with a similar offer, though theirs comes with far different intentions. I am aware, Mr. Price and his brother. They speak of marriage as though it were a transaction to settle a debt. I would rather remain unwed and poor than become an ornament in a house that sees me as nothing more than a charitable rescue." "Then we agree on one thing already," Theodore said. "I did not come here to rescue you, Miss Colworth. I came to keep a promise, and to see for myself whether that promise could ever be more than an obligation." She studied him carefully. as though trying to read whether his words carried any hidden design. "And if it cannot be more, if I remain nothing more than a promise you feel bound to keep, then I will have kept my word to a dying friend, and you will have gained a title that protects you from men like Mr. Price, who see your circumstances as an opportunity rather than a tragedy." Margaret's fingers tightened around the letter. Somewhere behind them, footsteps approached, and Mr. Price's voice called out impatiently from the front of the cottage, demanding to know how much longer his business would be delayed. "You should answer him," Theodore said quietly. "Whatever you decide, it should be your choice alone, not one made under my shadow." Margaret looked down at the letter once more, then folded it carefully and pressed it into her apron pocket. "Walk with me," she said. "I find I think more clearly when my hands are occupied and my feet are moving." They walked the length of the garden path together, the evening air cool against their faces. Margaret spoke little at first, gathering fallen leaves from between the herb rows, out of habit rather than purpose. Theodore matched her pace, saying nothing, allowing her the silence she seemed to need. "He used to write to me about you," she said eventually. "Gerald. He said you were the most honorable man he had ever known, though also the most stubborn. He was rarely wrong about anything." A faint smile touched her lips, gone as quickly as it appeared. "He said you would never break a promise, even one that cost you dearly. I intend to prove him right." They reached the end of the path, where the garden opened toward a low wooden gate, overlooking the fields beyond. Margaret rested her hands on the gate, staring out at the darkening horizon. "If I agree to this," she said slowly, "it will not be because I fear men like Mr. Price, though I do fear what they represent. It will be because Gerald trusted you with his final wish, and I owe him enough to trust that judgment as well. That is reason enough for me." She turned to face him fully. "But I will not pretend affection. I do not feel your grace. Not yet. If we do this, it must begin as what it truly is, an arrangement born from grief and loyalty. Nothing more." "I would not ask you to pretend anything," Theodore said. "Whatever grows between us, if anything grows at all, will grow honestly or not at all." Behind them, the cottage door opened, and Mr. Price's voice rang out sharply across the garden, demanding an answer before the hour grew later still. Margaret glanced toward the sound, then back at Theodore, something resolute settling into her expression. "Then let us give him his answer," she said, "and see what fate decides to do with the rest." Margaret walked back into the cottage with her chin lifted, though her heart pounded so loudly she feared everyone in the room could hear it. Mr. Price stood near the hearth, arms folded, his brother lingering by the window with an expression that suggested he had already grown bored of the entire affair. "Well," Mr. Price said, his tone clipped, "have you finished your private discussion with His Grace?" "I have," Margaret answered, "and I have made my decision." She glanced once at Theodore, who stood near the doorway, his face unreadable, before turning back to Mr. Price. "I thank you for your offer, sir, but I must decline it. I intend to accept a different arrangement, one already promised to me through Gerald Ashcombe before his passing." Mr. Price's expression shifted from surprise to something colder. "You would refuse a respectable offer from my family in favor of a hasty arrangement with a man who arrived at your door only an hour ago." "He did not arrive as a stranger," Margaret said evenly. "He arrived as the keeper of a promise made by the man I loved." "Loved," Mr. Price repeated, almost mockingly. "A vicar's daughter, engaged in secret to a gentleman who never once presented her to his family. Forgive me if I find the entire story difficult to believe." Theodore stepped forward then, his voice carrying the same quiet authority he had used earlier in the garden. "Believe what you wish, Mr. Price, But the matter is settled. Miss Colworth has made her choice, and I intend to honor it." Mr. Price's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking between the two of them with open suspicion. "This arrangement reeks of convenience, Your Grace. A dying man's final wish, conveniently discovered only after his passing, conveniently granting you a bride young enough and grateful enough to accept whatever terms you offer." "Careful," Theodore warned. "You accuse a dead man of dishonesty and a grieving woman of desperation. Neither accusation becomes you." The room fell silent for a long moment. Mr. Price's brother finally pushed away from the window, muttering something about wasted time, and gathered his coat from the chair. "Nathaniel, let us leave this foolishness behind. There are other prospects less complicated than this one." Mr. Price hesitated, his eyes lingering on Margaret with an expression she could not quite name, something between disappointment and calculation. "Very well," he said finally. "But do not expect this matter to end so simply, Your Grace. Word travels quickly among families like mine, and a duke marrying a penniless vicar's daughter within days of his friend's funeral will draw questions you may not enjoy answering." He offered a stiff bow before following his brother out the door. The housekeeper hurried after them to see them off, leaving Margaret and Theodore alone in the small sitting room, the fire crackling softly in the silence that followed. "He is not wrong," Margaret said quietly. "People will talk. They will assume the worst of both of us." "Let them talk," Theodore replied. "I have spent my life answering to expectations that never once considered what I wanted. I find I no longer care to explain myself to men like Mr. Price." Margaret studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then we should not delay. If this is to happen, it should happen quickly, before rumors have time to take root and twist themselves into something neither of us can control." Word of the sudden arrangement spread through the village faster than either of them expected. By the following morning, the baker's wife had already heard 3 different versions of the story, each one stranger than the last. Some said the Duke had fallen in love at first sight. Others whispered that Margaret had bewitched him somehow, using grief as her tool. A few even suggested she had planned the entire arrangement from the moment Gerald first fell ill, though anyone who knew her modest habits found that particular rumor impossible to believe. Margaret bore the whispers with quiet dignity, keeping to the cottage and its small garden, while Theodore rode into the village each day to settle matters with the vicar and arrange the necessary documents. He found himself surprised at how little the gossip troubled him, though he noticed it weighed more heavily on Margaret than she let show. "You need not pretend it does not wound you," he told her one afternoon, finding her seated quietly near the window, a piece of mending forgotten in her lap. "I see it in your eyes, even when you say nothing. I have spent my whole life being spoken of kindly," Margaret admitted. "My father was well respected. I never once had to defend my own name before. It is strange, suddenly finding myself the subject of every idle tongue in the county." "It will pass," Theodore said. "Gossip always finds fresher subjects eventually. I hope you are right." The vicar, a kind man named Mr. Aldous Ferris, who had taken over Margaret's father's duties, expressed some hesitation when Theodore first approached him about performing the ceremony. "Your Grace, I mean no disrespect, but such a swift marriage, so soon after Mr. Ashcombe's passing, will invite scrutiny from every corner of the county." "I am aware of the scrutiny it invites," Theodore answered. "I ask only that you perform the ceremony honestly, according to the vows both Miss Colworth and I intend to keep." Mr. Ferris studied him carefully, as though searching for some sign of deceit, then nodded slowly. "Very well, Your Grace. I knew her father well. He would have wanted her protected, Whatever form that protection took, they were married within the week, in a small ceremony at the village chapel, witnessed only by the housekeeper, Mr. Ferris, and a handful of curious villagers who gathered outside to catch a glimpse of the Duke who had arrived so suddenly and left so quickly changed. Margaret wore a simple gown, nothing grand, nothing that spoke of the title she now carried. Her hands trembled slightly as she recited her vows, though her voice never wavered. Theodore stood beside her through the entire ceremony, with a steadiness that surprised even himself, given how little time had passed since he first read Gerald's letter. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, a strange quiet settled over him, not quite joy, not quite grief, but something suspended carefully between the two. The journey back to Marsden Court took 2 full days, and Margaret spent much of it staring out the carriage window, watching the countryside shift from familiar hills to grander estates she had never imagined she would call home. Theodore sat across from her, occasionally pointing out landmarks, explaining the history of towns they passed, filling the silence with small facts that required no emotional weight to share. "You need not entertain me the entire journey," Margaret said at one point, a faint smile touching her lips. "I do not mind silence. Perhaps I am the one who needs the distraction," Theodore admitted. "This is all rather new to me as well, even for a duke who has faced far grander matters than a village wedding. Especially for a duke who has faced far grander matters," he said. "None of them required me to consider another person's happiness quite so carefully." When they finally arrived, the staff lined up outside to greet their new duchess. Curtsies and bows offered with practiced precision, though Margaret could feel the curious glances following her every movement. She adjusted slowly to life within the estate, learning the names of servants, the layout of hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly, the expectations placed upon a woman of her new station. Theodore proved patient through it all, correcting her gently when needed, defending her fiercely when members of his own family arrived to question the suddenness of the marriage. His aunt, Lady Weatherfield, arrived within the first fortnight, sweeping into the drawing room with an expression of barely concealed disapproval. "A vicar's daughter," she said, looking Margaret over as though inspecting livestock at market. "Theodore, have you lost every sense you were born with?" "I have gained a wife," Theodore replied evenly. "One I intend to see respected in this house, regardless of her birth." Lady Weatherfield's eyes narrowed. "Respect is earned through breeding, nephew, not granted through pity for a dead man's final wish." Margaret, standing quietly near the window, felt the sting of the words but said nothing, choosing instead to meet the older woman's gaze without flinching. Something in her steady composure seemed to unsettle Lady Weatherfield more than any argument could have, and the older woman eventually left without further comment, though her disapproval lingered in the air long after she departed. That evening, once the household had quieted, Margaret found Theodore alone in his study, staring at a portrait of Gerald that hung above the fireplace. She hesitated at the doorway, unsure whether to intrude, but he noticed her presence and gestured for her to enter. "She will come around eventually," Theodore said, still looking at the portrait. "My aunt. She disapproves of most things, until she no longer has the energy to maintain it." I do not need her approval," Margaret said, stepping further into the room. "I only wish to prove that Gerald's trust in me was not misplaced." "It was not," Theodore said, finally turning to face her. "I see it more clearly each day." Weeks passed, and slowly, carefully, something began to shift between Theodore and Margaret that neither of them had expected. Small moments accumulated quietly. Theodore found himself seeking her out during idle afternoons, drawn to the quiet way she hummed while arranging flowers in the drawing room. the sharp wit she revealed only when she felt comfortable enough to speak freely. Margaret, in turn, began noticing the weight Theodore carried silently, the way grief for Gerald still shadowed his eyes when he thought no one watched. She began joining him for breakfast each morning, a habit neither of them had planned, but both had come to expect. Their conversations grew longer, touching on subjects far beyond the estate's daily concerns. Theodore found himself telling her stories of his childhood, of his father's strict expectations, of the years he spent proving himself worthy of a title he never asked to inherit. Margaret listened without judgment, offering her own stories in return, of her mother's early death, of the quiet years spent assisting her father with his parish duties, of the small joys she found in tending her garden. "Your father sounds like he was a good man," Theodore said one morning, watching her stir sugar into her tea with practiced ease. "He was the best man I knew, until I met Gerald." Margaret paused, considering her words carefully. "And now, I find myself wondering whether that list might grow longer still." Theodore said nothing, though something in his chest tightened pleasantly at her words, a feeling he had not allowed himself to name yet. One evening, as autumn settled fully over the estate, they walked together through the gardens after supper, a habit that had grown between them without either acknowledging when it began. "You still think of him," Margaret said softly, watching Theodore's expression as they passed beneath a row of bare trees. "Every day," he admitted. "I keep expecting to hear his laugh somewhere down the hall, or find him waiting in the study with some scheme he wants my help executing. I feel it too. Sometimes I forget, for a moment, that he is gone, and I think of something I want to tell him before I remember." Theodore glanced at her, something softening in his expression. "I am glad you can still speak of him without pain overwhelming you entirely. He would want us to remember him with warmth, not grief alone." Margaret paused near a stone bench, settling onto it, as Theodore joined her. "Do you ever wonder what he intended, truly, when he wrote that letter? Whether he hoped for more than simple protection?" "I have wondered," Theodore admitted, "though I suspect even he did not know exactly what he hoped for, only that he trusted me enough to leave the rest to chance." Margaret smiled faintly, the first genuine smile Theodore had seen cross her face since her arrival at the estate. "Then perhaps we should trust that chance as well, and see where it leads us, rather than forcing ourselves into roles neither of us chose freely." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind moved softly through the bare branches above them, and somewhere in the distance an owl called out into the darkening sky. Theodore studied her profile in the fading light, noting how the weeks at the estate had softened the exhaustion that once lined her face, how her posture had grown steadier, more certain of her place within these walls. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I did not expect, when I rode to Brampton Hollow, to find anything beyond a promise fulfilled. I want you to know that whatever grows between us now grows honestly, without pressure, without expectation, beyond what you are willing to give." "I know that," she said. "I have known it since the garden, that first evening. It is part of why I trusted you enough to agree at all." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps along the garden path. A young footman approached, breathless, holding a folded note. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption, but a letter arrived just now, marked urgent." Theodore took the letter, breaking the seal quickly. His expression darkened as he read, and Margaret rose from the bench, sensing the shift in his mood immediately. "What is it?" "Mr. Price," Theodore said grimly. "It seems he has made good on his threat. He has written to several members of society, questioning the legitimacy of our marriage, suggesting it was arranged under suspicious circumstances, designed to secure my fortune for a woman with no true claim to Gerald's affections." Margaret's face paled. He would spread such lies. He would. And worse, he claims to have evidence suggesting Gerald's letter was forged, written not by Gerald himself, but by someone seeking to manipulate the circumstances of his death for personal gain. That is absurd. You know Gerald's handwriting, as well as your own. I know it, Theodore agreed. But proving it to a society eager for scandal is another matter entirely. Mr. Price has connections within the courts, connections that could cause significant trouble if this accusation gains enough traction. Margaret sank back onto the bench, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Then what do? We fight it, Theodore said firmly. I will not allow a man like Mr. Price to tarnish Gerald's memory or threaten everything we have built here, however brief that building has been. He extended his hand toward her, and Margaret took it without hesitation, rising to stand beside him. Whatever comes, she said, we face it together. I did not marry you simply to hide behind your title, Theodore. I married you, honoring a promise, and I intend to see that promise protected, no matter what lies Mr. Price chooses to spread. Theodore studied her for a long moment, something warm flickering behind his eyes, despite the grim news they had just received. You called me by my given name, he said softly. You have not done that before. Margaret realized her slip only after he pointed it out, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not mean to presume. Do not apologize, he interrupted gently. I find I much prefer it to the title. They stood together in the darkening garden, the weight of Mr. Price's threat hanging over them, yet something steady had settled between them, despite the danger ahead. Theodore folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his coat, his resolve hardening with each passing moment. We will need Gerald's personal solicitor, he said, already forming a plan. He can confirm the letter's authenticity, along with any correspondence Gerald sent regarding his intentions toward you. We will also need witnesses from Brampton Hollow who can testify to your engagement, however secret it remains. The housekeeper knew, Margaret offered. She saw the letters Gerald sent over the months before his final journey. She could speak to their contents, even if she never read them fully herself. Then we begin there. Theodore's jaw set with quiet determination. There is also the matter of Mr. Price's own motives. A man does not threaten such trouble over simple disapproval. I suspect he wanted you for reasons beyond charity, and finding himself refused has wounded more than his pride. Margaret considered this. He did look at me strangely, near the end, before he left, as though he had already decided something, and my refusal had only delayed it. Then we watch him carefully, Theodore said. A wounded man with connections in the courts is dangerous, but a wounded man with something to hide is far more dangerous still. As they walked back toward the house together, neither spoke further of the danger waiting ahead, though both understood clearly that the battle Mr. Price had threatened was only just beginning, and that the coming weeks would test not only their marriage, but the fragile trust that had only just begun to grow between them. The following morning, Theodore rode out early to visit Gerald's solicitor, a careful man named Mr. Hollis Bramwell, who kept offices near the county courthouse. Margaret remained at the estate, though the waiting proved harder than she expected. She busied herself with small tasks, arranging linens, walking the garden paths, anything to keep her hands moving, while her mind circled endlessly around Mr. Price's threats. Theodore returned by early evening, his expression carrying a mixture of relief and renewed worry. He found Margaret in the drawing room and settled beside her before speaking. Mr. Bramwell confirms the letter's authenticity without hesitation. He recognized Gerald's hand immediately and has agreed to testify if the matter reaches formal proceedings. He also produced earlier correspondence Gerald sent him months before his death, mentioning you by name and outlining his intentions clearly. Margaret exhaled slowly. Then Mr. Price's accusation has no foundation. None whatsoever, though that will not stop him from spreading it. Men like Mr. Price rarely care for truth when reputation alone can accomplish what truth cannot. What did Mr. Bramwell say of Mr. Price himself? Theodore's jaw tightened. That is the part that concerns me most. Mr. Bramwell mentioned that Mr. Price approached him weeks ago, before Gerald's death, asking questions about the estate's finances and inheritance structure. He wanted to know what would happen to Gerald's holdings should he die without a wife or heir. Margaret's eyes widened. You believe he knew Gerald was dying and hoped to secure some claim through me before anyone else arrived? I believe it is possible. His family's fortune has suffered losses these past years, quietly enough that society has not yet noticed. A marriage to a woman connected to Gerald's estate, however distantly, might have offered him leverage he desperately needed. Then his anger is not truly about honor or propriety. It is about money he lost the moment I refused him. Precisely. Theodore rose and paced toward the window, staring out at the darkening grounds. Which means he will not stop quietly. Men desperate for money rarely surrender without forcing every possible advantage first. His words proved true within days. A formal letter arrived from Mr. Price's solicitor, demanding an inquiry into the circumstances of Gerald's final letter, insisting that the courts examine whether undue influence had been exercised upon a dying man in his weakest hour. The accusation implied, without stating outright, that Theodore himself had manipulated his closest friend for personal gain, a suggestion so vile that Theodore nearly rode to confront Mr. Price directly before Margaret convinced him otherwise. Violence will only strengthen his claims, she said, gripping his arm as he reached for his coat. He wants you to react rashly. Do not give him that satisfaction. Theodore forced himself to still, though the anger simmering beneath his composure remained visible in the tightness of his shoulders. Then what would you have me do instead? Fight him properly. Through the courts, through witnesses, through truth laid so plainly that even his connections cannot twist it further. The inquiry proceeded over the following weeks, drawing attention from every corner of society, eager for scandal, involving a duke's sudden marriage. Margaret found herself the subject of whispered conversations wherever she went, though she carried herself with a composure that surprised even Lady Weatherfield, who had begun, despite herself, to soften slightly in her opinion of the new Duchess. Meanwhile, Theodore worked closely with his own solicitor, a sharp-minded man named Mr. Silas Redmayne, gathering every piece of evidence that might strengthen their position before the hearing. Redmayne suggested quietly investigating Mr. Price's own financial records, a suggestion Theodore initially resisted, feeling it beneath him to stoop toward the same tactics Mr. Price had used against them. Your Grace, Redmayne said carefully, sometimes the only way to stop a man from throwing stones is to show the court exactly what glass house he lives in himself. I do not suggest dishonesty. I suggest simply uncovering what already exists. Theodore relented eventually, and Redmayne's investigation uncovered exactly what Theodore had begun to suspect. Mr. Price's family estate carried debts far beyond what society realized. Debts accumulated through poor investments and reckless spending that threatened to consume the family's remaining holdings within a few short years. A marriage to Margaret, however distantly connected to Gerald's estate, would have offered Mr. Price access to funds and connections desperately needed to stabilize his family's crumbling fortune. The formal hearing took place in a modest chamber attached to the county courthouse, presided over by a magistrate known for his impatience with frivolous claims. Mr. Price arrived with his solicitor, presenting his accusations with practiced confidence, suggesting that Gerald's illness had left him vulnerable to manipulation, that Theodore had perhaps composed the letter himself, or at minimum encouraged Gerald toward a decision that served Theodore's own interests in ways not yet fully understood. Mr. Bramwell testified first, confirming the letter's authenticity through years of familiarity with Gerald's handwriting, presenting the earlier correspondence that clearly outlined Gerald's intentions long before his final illness worsened. The housekeeper from Brampton Hollow testified next, describing the letters Gerald had sent Margaret over many months, confirming the engagement had existed long before anyone suspected his health would fail so completely. Mr. Price's solicitor attempted to discredit both witnesses, suggesting bias, suggesting confusion, suggesting that grief had clouded their memories of events. The magistrate listened patiently, though his expression grew increasingly skeptical of the accusations being presented without solid evidence to support them. Then Mr. Price made an error that would ultimately undo his entire case. Pressed by the magistrate to explain his own interest in the matter, he stumbled through an explanation of concern for Margaret's welfare that rang hollow even to those unfamiliar with his earlier visit to Brampton Hollow. Redmayne, prepared for exactly this moment, produced correspondence between Mr. Price and his brother, obtained legally through careful investigation, revealing explicit discussion of the financial benefits a marriage to Margaret might have secured for their struggling estate. The chamber fell silent as the magistrate read the letters aloud, his expression darkening with each line. Mr. Price's face drained of color, his earlier confidence collapsing entirely as the truth of his own motives became impossible to hide. His brother, seated behind him, buried his face in his hands, clearly humiliated by the exposure unfolding before the entire chamber. "It appears," the magistrate said finally, "that the true manipulation in this matter comes not from His Grace or the late Mr. Ashcombe, but from the very man bringing these accusations forward. This inquiry is dismissed, and I would advise Mr. Price to consider carefully before bringing further false claims before this court. Further attempts at such deception may result in consequences far graver than public embarrassment." Mr. Price left the chamber without a word, his brother trailing behind him with an expression of open embarrassment. Margaret watched them go, relief flooding through her so completely that her knees nearly gave way beneath her. Theodore caught her arm gently, steadying her as they walked from the courthouse together. "It is over," he said softly. "Whatever damage he intended, he has done far more harm to himself than he ever managed against us. I confess, I feel no joy in his ruin," Margaret admitted. "Only relief that the truth finally stood stronger than his lies." "That is precisely why Gerald trusted you," Theodore said. "You feel compassion, even for those who wished you harm. It is a rare quality, and one I have come to admire deeply." The weeks following the hearing brought a quiet that neither Theodore nor Margaret had experienced since Gerald's death. Society's attention shifted elsewhere, as it always did, moving toward fresher scandals and leaving the Duke and his Duchess to settle into a life neither had fully anticipated when their story began. Lady Weatherfield visited again in early winter, her manner considerably softer than her first appearance. She found Margaret in the garden, wrapped warmly against the cold, tending to the last of the season's herbs before the frost claimed them entirely. "I confess," Lady Weatherfield said, settling onto the same stone bench Margaret had once shared with Theodore. "I misjudged you rather severely when we first met." "You judged based on what little you knew," Margaret answered without bitterness. "I cannot fault you for caution, given how quickly everything unfolded. Perhaps, though watching you weather Mr. Price's accusations with such steadiness has taught me something about character that breeding alone cannot provide." Lady Weatherfield studied her carefully. Theodore seems different since your arrival. Lighter, somehow, despite everything that has happened. Margaret said nothing, though a small smile touched her lips as she continued her work among the herbs. I have decided, Lady Weatherfield continued, to host a small gathering in the spring, introducing you properly to those members of society who matter most. It is time this household stopped hiding from whispers and instead gave people something honest to see. Margaret looked up, surprised. You would do this for me. I would do this for Theodore, and for the memory of a young man who entrusted his final wish to the right hands after all. Lady Weatherfield rose from the bench, brushing invisible dust from her skirts. Do not disappoint me, Margaret. I have staked my own reputation on your character now. I will not disappoint you, Margaret promised, and meant every word of it. That evening, Theodore found her still in the garden, watching the last light fade behind the hills. He settled beside her without speaking at first, content simply to share the silence that had grown so comfortable between them over the passing months. Gerald would be pleased, Margaret said eventually, to see how thoroughly Mr. Price's schemes collapsed against him. He would, Theodore agreed, though I suspect he would be more pleased by other developments. He turned to face her fully. Margaret, I promised you honesty from the beginning, that whatever grew between us would grow without pretense or obligation. I find I can no longer pretend this arrangement remains simply a promise kept. Margaret's breath caught slightly. What are you saying, Theodore? I am saying I have fallen in love with you, entirely apart from any promise made to Gerald, entirely apart from duty or obligation. I love the strength you showed against Mr. Price, the quiet dignity you carry, despite everything society has thrown against you, the way you speak of Gerald with warmth, rather than only grief. Tears gathered in Margaret's eyes, though she smiled through them. I have loved you for weeks now, Theodore, though I feared saying it aloud might break whatever careful balance we had built. I feared you might still see this only as a promise kept, nothing more. It began as a promise, Theodore admitted, reaching for her hand, but it has become something far greater than anything Gerald could have imagined when he wrote that letter. You are not simply the fulfillment of his final wish, Margaret. You are the love of my life, found in the most unexpected way possible. They sat together as darkness fully claimed the garden, hands joined, hearts finally speaking the truth both had carried silently for weeks. The estate around them settled into quiet, servants extinguishing candles one by one, the household preparing for another peaceful evening after months of turmoil. Spring arrived early that year, bringing warmth back to the gardens Margaret had tended so carefully through the winter months. Lady Weatherfield kept her promise, hosting a gathering that drew much of society curious to finally meet the vicar's daughter, who had become a duchess through such extraordinary circumstances. Margaret moved through the evening with quiet grace, answering questions honestly, refusing to hide from the curiosity surrounding her, and by the night's end, even the most skeptical guests found themselves charmed by her sincerity. The estate had settled fully into its new rhythm, Margaret's presence woven seamlessly into every corner of Marsden Court, from the servants who had grown genuinely fond of her gentle authority to Lady Weatherfield, who now visited regularly, her earlier disapproval replaced entirely by warm affection for the woman who had proven herself far stronger than any title could measure. Mr. Price's family, disgraced by the hearing's outcome, retreated from society entirely, their financial troubles worsening without the advantageous marriage they had hoped to secure. Theodore heard occasional word of their continued decline, though he found he no longer carried any anger toward the man who had once threatened everything he held dear. Victory, he realized, required no further punishment beyond the consequences Mr. Price had brought upon himself. On a warm afternoon in early summer, Theodore found Margaret in the garden once more, kneeling beside the same herbs she had tended since her arrival, her hands stained with soil, just as they had been the day he first found her in Brampton Hollow. He watched her for a long moment, before she noticed his presence, struck again by how thoroughly his life had changed since that night he broke the seal on Gerald's final letter. "You are staring," Margaret said without looking up, though amusement colored her voice. "I am remembering," Theodore replied, settling onto the ground beside her, despite the impropriety it would have caused in his younger years. "The first time I saw you kneeling exactly like this, gathering herbs while your world had already begun crumbling beneath you. I remember it too. I thought you had come to inspect me, like some curiosity Gerald had left behind. I came to keep a promise. I stayed because I found something I never expected to find." He took her soil-stained hand gently on his own. "Gerald asked me to protect you, Margaret. He never once asked me to love you. That part I discovered entirely on my own, and I have never been more grateful for anything in my life." Margaret leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder as the afternoon sun warmed the garden around them. "He gave us both a gift, in the end, even through his loss. I only wish he could see how far we have come since that terrible night." "Perhaps he does," Theodore said softly. Perhaps he knew, even then, exactly what he was setting into motion when he wrote those final words. He trusted me with his heart's dearest wish, and somehow that trust became the very thing that saved us both. They remained together in the garden as the sun climbed higher, two hearts bound first by promise, then by choice, and finally by a love neither had expected, but both had come to cherish completely. Proof that even the darkest beginnings could bloom into something far more beautiful than either had dared to imagine, and proof that a promise kept out of loyalty could, in time, become a love kept out of nothing but the truest devotion of the heart.